Tonight on Free Minds TV, we have both good news and bad news coming out of the state of California. It looks like the RIAA is trying to demolish the Fourth Amendment with a proposed piece of legislation, but prisons are being ordered to reduce the prison population. Plus, we have news on the state of Utah legalizing gold and silver coins for use as currency. That plus more coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Thank you for tuning in to episode 206 of Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. With you, as always, is Toby.
And Nick.
We have a lot to talk about today. It's going to be out west, really, for the people out there, which is kind of appropriate. We did just get put on a station out in California, so we have a couple of stories coming from out there, as well as in Utah. I don't think
the U.S. is a big place. I mean, not that our show is necessarily focused just on the U.S., because we do stories out of, say, the UK or Australia from time to time.
I think all our cable viewers are out of the U.S., though.
Yeah,
scattered around the U.S. I mean, around different states in the U.S. But then again, we do post it on other places that people can get it via the audio and the YouTube version, as well as some other sources out there. But for I think the majority.
Most of you watching are Americans.
Right. So we are going to be focusing in on some stories, as you said, a little bit of good news with the Supreme Court ordering some of the cruel and unusual punishment, as in their words, they're calling some of the states of the prisons out there, as well as some bad news about eviscerating the Fourth Amendment. I know we talked about it last week coming out of Indiana, where they're essentially saying
they're saying that you can't resist a police officer who is entering your home illegally, and I guess they're construing that, some sheriffs are construing that to mean that they can do, in their words, house-to-house searches without a warrant.
And these ideas in government, they seem to usually spread, and it wasn't long before I found a story about proposed legislation that seems to be sailing right through the various branches of government to become law that's going to be going after copyright infringes, and really it just completely ignores the Fourth Amendment. But before we get into that, I did want to just mention that in the next couple of weeks, next 3 weeks, we're going to be doing a special edition of Free Minds TV. We've done a few of these now up at PorcFest 2011, part of the Free State Project, where they're not our sponsors, but we think that they're one of the last hopes for real freedom in this world. I mean, you can live your own life as free as possible and ignore the laws, or you can hope to maybe change them for other people as well, and that's part of what the Free State Project is doing. So there's all sorts of different ways to do it. We've talked all about it a lot, so if you are curious about it, maybe check out that special, or if you're interested in the Free State Project in general, check out PorcFest 2011. We're going to be filming on the June 23rd and 24th is when we're going to be doing the majority of our filming. So we'll be up there, up at Rogers Campground. Log on to, I think, porcfest.com for more info is where you can get that. Or just check out the special when it comes out. All right, that being said, let's get right into it. What's going on in California? Well, it looks like justices in a 5-4 decision tell California to cut its prison population by at least 30,000 prisoners. Conditions in California's overcrowded prisons are so bad that they may violate the 8th Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court ruled on Monday, ordering the state to reduce the prison population. Justice Anthony M. Kennedy, writing for the majority in a 5-4 decision, said that the prison system has failed to deliver minimal care to prisoners with serious mental health problems and has produced, quote, needless suffering and even death. They also wrote about, quote, the telephone booth-sized cages without toilets that some of the prisoners have to sit in all day, and talked about the 80% higher suicide rate in California prisons than the rest of the nation, as well as it looks like at least one prisoner a week dies in the California prison system because of the overcrowding. California has a prison population that is supposed to stay under 110,000, but it is over. It's in the 160, 140 range. It's at 137.5%. I guess that's what they have to reduce it to, is 137.5%. Still allowed to be way over what they're supposed to have. But hey, it's could be some good news. Now here's the issue, though. is potential for good news, because they're saying, well, let's reduce some of the prison population, which we on this show say, whoa, yeah, obviously we have too many people in prison when you're supposed to be the freest nation in the whole world, and you have more people in prison than any other nation in the world. Even those really big ones like China, 1.5 billion people, only have 1.5 million people behind bars. Here in the United States, 300 million people, over 2 million people behind the bars. You go, something's wrong there. So it has the potential to be some good news, because we're reducing this number by a small hair. But the problem is, which prisoners are they going to reduce? Are they going to be letting go some of the so-called criminals who are in there for victimless crimes? I don't know. Maybe, but probably not. It's probably going to be a little bit more randomized than that. You know, 25...
Let all the bad people out that do need to be in prison?
I don't know, 25% of the prisoners in federal prisons out there, they are there for completely victimless crimes. Didn't hurt anybody. And then you've got more that are in there for things like burglary, robbery, and assault, who are there that committed crimes in order to get drugs. So that's kind of another symptom of the war on drugs and war on vice crimes in general. So you gotta say, is this really good news? Well, at least they're recognizing that there's a major issue and saying you have to make the major issue less. But it's not really doing that much. It's only reducing the prison to make it a little bit better, and there's nothing in the court decision about who's being released.
Right. I mean, if you want to actually treat the source of the problem of the prison overcrowding, that would be what they're referring to now as overcriminalization, or the fact that there are too many laws on the books addressing behaviors that really are not criminal, or they're not properly something that falls under the purview of the criminal justice
There's something that
system.
may be socially awkward or socially unacceptable, but does it really warrant putting someone in a cage for and having them, all the taxpayers, foot that bill? Do you really want to ruin someone's life and seriously putting them in a cage like an animal? I mean, that's what we're doing. And I think sometimes people go, oh, they're going to prison, they'll be reformed. Really, we're putting humans in a cage. We realize we're doing that, right? And I think that some people need to be in cages. There are some very bad people out there that do hurt, kill, kidnap, murder, rape people. Those people, the cage is a good place for them. But there's also other people who might have some kind of a drug addiction or trying to... I don't believe putting them in cages is right. It seems like morally reprehensible in a lot of cases.
Right, and you don't just have to address the morality of whether it's right to incarcerate them for something that's basically, you're living an unhealthy lifestyle, so we'll put you in prison because we don't like the way you're living. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And you're not doing society a benefit. I mean, that's another way you can look at it, is when you're putting people in prison for, say, marijuana possession or prostitution or a lot of the other vice crimes out there, gambling in many states. They're not quite as strict in many states as they used to be with those laws, but gambling can still land you in prison. You're not really doing the person you're incarcerating a favor, because the odds that you're going to get them to stop whatever it is that would be generally viewed as a negative behavior. You're probably not actually going to treat the underlying reasons why they're engaging in that behavior. And number two, you're making them a convict. You're giving them a criminal record. It's going to be much, much harder for them to get a job. They might have been able to hold down a job with a drug problem or as a recovering addict or with a gambling problem. But with a conviction, especially if it's a felony conviction for a victimless crime, essentially you've guaranteed that that person is not going to have any good job prospects from the day they're released forward. And I think the odds of them reoffending are much higher. And California runs into this problem because they've got reoffender laws. They've got a 3-strike rule in California where, 3 felony convictions and then you're in for life. They might not be terribly serious felonies, but,
Well, we were talking about, it wasn't in California, but I think it was last show or two that we were talking about a man, I think it was in Louisiana. I don't know, it's past a couple of shows. He got life in prison for something like the 3rd or 4th time he was of possession of marijuana. And so, because he had all these, he's a serious offender. He's doing it over and over again.
Habitual, so.
But he just got busted with pot a few times, and now he's in prison for life.
And maybe he was distributing it, but he wasn't. He didn't seem. He wasn't.
But now he's in a cage forever. And the dissenters, because this was a 5-4 decision. 4 out of the 9 justices who ruled in this thought that we should continue incarcerating people in overcrowded prisons that violated the 8th Amendment. So just throwing that out there. It wasn't like some kind of a landslide here. 4 of the justices say, no, you should still keep the people in cages even if they're climbing on top of each other. And it's violation of some of the basic human rights out there. But they do have a good point. They fear that the decision will have prisoner release will lead to a grim roster of victims. And I hope I'm wrong, but we'll see in a few years, wrote Justice Alito. And you know what? To a certain extent, he's right. Because as you addressed, Nick, we're not rehabilitating these prisoners. What we're doing is taking someone who could have moved on with their life and making that impossible. They can't get a job if you have a drug conviction on your record. Every time you go to apply for a legitimate job, you're going to be turned away. You can only get these really low-paying jobs that can't even pay the bills, the rent, the food on the table. So a lot of these people, they turn to crime, either selling drugs or robbery. You know, the gray or the black market is where they typically turn to. Not all of them, but that's where there's money because we put a black ball on them for life.
Well, and, you know, part of imprisoning somebody, it is a form of punishment. I mean,
yes.
That's obviously true.
Punishment / rehabilitation / protection.
Well, there's a bunch of different theories. I think in reality, right now, it's being used as a tool to punish people, and that's going to be true really no matter what spin you put on it, locking somebody up or executing them, which is the other option you have in the U.S. justice system. It's hard to say that that's anything but punishment, but it seems to make sense to me, Toby, that if you are incarcerating people, not necessarily for victimless crimes, but for some of the less serious crimes against property, which I do think there should be laws against, you know, if people are in there because they stole something or, you know, they got in a couple of fist fights, but they're not really serious criminals, they're not terribly violent, they're not predatory, you know, you might want to think about looking at doing a little bit more in the way of rehabilitation.
Yeah.
Because, you know, just packing about, you know, a few hundred people into a prison gymnasium like they're doing in some of these prisons in California, throwing them on bunk beds and not really doing anything to try to help them establish.
Warehousing them.
Right. You're not giving them any skills. You're not trying to teach them anything except that you better not do whatever it is you did or you'll end up back in here.
Well, they're learning skills, Nick. They're learning skills. I mean, I think
how to make a shiv.
Yeah, or
how to smuggle drugs into the prison in your orifices.
The movie Blow, which was based on a true story, put it well. I don't know the exact quote, but it was something along the lines. I went in with a BA in marijuana distribution, came out with a PhD in cocaine distribution. They're learning things. It's how to do the next level of crime. So how to smuggle things, how to get into some of the harder drug smuggling out there, how to properly break into someone's house and not get busted. So they are learning things. It's just the opposite of what rehabilitation should be teaching them. So I think that there's a fundamental flaw in this whole so-called justice system, and then the industrial prison complex that's out there is kind of sickening as well. I'm not saying that no one needs to be in prison, but I'm saying that there is some major issues going on with what's happening here.
Well, you certainly don't need
not just in California. This is a systemic problem throughout the U.S.
We certainly don't need as many people in prison as we have now. It doesn't make us safer.
And it's not like the victims of anything are ever compensated. If you're robbed, you're typically not compensated. That's what I'd want. If someone robbed my house and then they caught the person.
How about getting my money back?
Yeah, how about you go get a job and pay me, and then pay me for some of the pain and suffering. That'll make me a lot happier than that person just sitting in a cage thinking about the next person he's going to rob as soon as he gets out.
You get nothing back.
Yeah, you pay me. That makes more sense. Or maybe you do that in jail. Maybe you're stamping license plates, making some money, but I'm getting your paycheck because you're the person whose house I got my house broken into. You stole my crap. Yeah. Now pay me, rather than me, the taxpayer, having to just foot your bill to keep you in prison until you get out and do the same thing over again. Fundamental flaws in the system. Yeah. And while this is nice that some people are going to be let out, maybe it's not even the ones who should be. I don't know.
Well, I don't know that. There are certainly flaws with the criminal justice system and with the correctional system after that, if people are convicted. But I think the fundamental flaw is that government is too big. They're criminalizing activities that shouldn't be matters for the government or the criminal justice system.
Is there a victim? No? Okay. No crime. That's that I think we should be number one. Where's the victim?
Did you commit an offense against somebody's person or property, or did you do something that was, so reckless and dangerous to others that it could be considered an offense against them? If it doesn't fit those criteria, then why are these people in prison?
And if this,
because you don't like the way they were living their
funny,
life, so you just
so much of the
lock
time
them up?
the state is the victim too. I always find
against
that
the
funny.
peace and dignity of the state.
The state is a victim. You violated a fictional entity.
Right.
You've created a victim there. Yeah. Anyways, we do need to move on to some more bad news coming out. Well, I guess that was bad news about the criminal justice system. So we got to move on to some real bad news, though. That's the evisceration of the Fourth Amendment, completely ruining it, taking it away. Might as well not exist, it seems, or at least that's the way things are going. We are about halfway down this slippery slope, I think, and I don't know how far the bottom, how far it is until we reach the bottom. But man, the Fourth Amendment, it has been chipped away at and chipped away at. They're never going to take it away. They always, in modern jurisprudence, I think. That's some of the words I've been...
Jurisprudence.
How do you say it?
Jurisprudence.
Jurisprudence. That's, in modern day jurisprudence, the Fourth Amendment should be interpreted this way. Even though it's pretty clear. But anyways, this coming out of California, apparently the U.S. Constitution no longer applies when it comes to battling music and movie piracy. Consider California legislation already passed by two state Senate committees. It allows law enforcement to enter optical disc plants and seized disc stamping equipment and pirate movie and music discs without a court warrant. Quote, the crime of illegal mass reproduction of music and movies is a serious problem. Last year alone, more than 820,000 illegal discs were seized by law enforcement authorities in California. State Senator Alex Padilla wrote, and blah, 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 and how we need this law to protect the revenue and the artists and the retailers in the entertainment sector. So because it's such a problem, we should pass a law that completely violates and kind of circumvents the Fourth Amendment because it's such an issue. And that's our reasoning, because it's such an issue. Now, is that a reason to violate one of the fundamental principles that backs your entire form of government because it's an issue? If that's the case, well, I guess there should be no Fourth Amendment at all. Because we're looking for criminals, rapists, this is a real problem, murderers, this is a real problem, burglars, a real problem. I mean, however you look at it, it's a real problem. Law enforcement, if they're not going after real problems, well, let's fire them because they're useless. So everything's a real problem. That is not a reason, though, to completely get rid of the Fourth Amendment and say you don't need a court order to go into any kind of a business or a household or whatever it is just because it's a real problem. Right?
Yeah, well, that would make a lot of sense. It's a little too common sense for the courts.
But
in
Nick,
this day and
isn't
age.
a rapist a real problem?
Yeah, you would think it's more serious than somebody illegally
Isn't a
downloading
murderer
music.
a real problem? A
Yeah.
kidnapper a real problem?
I would argue
but you
it's a
still
more
need
severe
court
problem.
orders to
well,
go and search a house of a suspect.
And for good reason. I mean, if if you start picking and choosing and saying that, as you pointed out, whenever there's a serious crime being committed, or what the state would argue is a serious crime, or not a very serious crime, but somebody can say there's a good reason we should do these searches.
But it's okay, Nick. It's narrowly tailored. Narrowly tailored legislation.
I'm sure it's very narrow.
Which means it's only for this issue.
The problem.
Well, let's write one that's only for murderers, and then what's one that's only for burglars, and down the line.
Right, but the problem is that when you start making those, further down the line, basically
anyone
you
with
end
a
up with
brain,
a society.
anyone with a thinking part of their brain that hasn't been lobotomized yet, we don't need to explain this to. This is for the dummies out there.
If you're going to have a protection, things like due process, where a court order needs to be granted after cause is shown to do something like search someone's house or their business or their computer. If you're going to have that protection in place, it's meaningless unless it's in place for everybody. And when you combine that with the presumption of innocence, which has sort of been trampled on too in other cases, especially in the case of allegations of terrorism, you're presumed innocent by the justice system. That's another part of due process. So how are you necessarily going to say, well, we have these real problems out there, and the people we really think are guilty, before we've allowed a finder of fact to do that, a finder of fact would be a judge or a jury, the people we really think might be guilty, well, we don't need warrants to search them. Well, then they could just apply that to anybody. If they're searching you, they probably think you've done something wrong. Or at least that's the allegation. They do phishing, but if they're phishing, they still think you've probably done something wrong. They're just not sure what it is.
Yeah.
We don't know what it is yet.
You must have, well, with all the laws on the book, chances are you've done something wrong. That's why fishing expeditions are so successful, because everybody breaks a law here and there. You can't know all the laws and not break them.
Some people
Millions of them
commit
on the
very
books.
serious violations when you look at some of the federal laws. I mean,
You just don't know you're doing it half the
Right.
time. How can you know all the laws? Yeah, ignorance of the law is no excuse.
you ever shipped a cell phone battery through UPS without labeling it? I think that's one that
Really?
supposedly there are labeling requirements. I don't know if it's a cell phone battery, but there's certain things you need to label. And I'm
Well,
sure there are plenty of people who have shipped those things
there
without
are-
labeling them.
there are
because
millions of
if
them.
you're somebody living at home, you don't know all those statutes. You know, I mean, there's plenty of offenses you can commit without doing anything wrong and without really knowing it, because there's so many laws on the books at the federal, state, and local level.
The other thing I just want to point out here about this this whole RIAA and intellectual property robbing, blah, blah, blah. If you like an artist, I say support them. Buy the actual copy from the artist. But when they say that they are robbing artists and the whole entertainment industry, that is the presumption that people who are buying the pirated copies or downloading their peer-to-peer would have bought them anyways. And that's a presumption that I don't think is often correct. A lot of people, I think, are more likely to buy a DVD for $1 if it's pirated than they're likely to pay $22 in a store. So it's a presumption that every single copy that was pirated.
Oh, but you stole their
otherwise would have been-
intellectual property.
Right, but the presumption is by stealing it, they're losing money, and I don't think that that's always the case. Sometimes, yes, but not always. I just want to throw
Yeah, but
that
you
out
get
there.
to enjoy it. Even if you weren't going to buy it, you still get to enjoy their intellectual
Right, but
property.
you're not actually robbing from the artist because they wouldn't have gotten the money anyways. Because
I see the point you're making.
$22 was a little bit too much to buy, but for $1 on the street,
I
well,
see
maybe.
the point. In practical terms, you're not.
Right, in practical terms, what actually matters.
Right.
Right.
So I don't know. I think
I say if you like an
I
artist,
think the recording
actually support
industry
them, but-
and the government is fighting a very losing battle.
Yeah, they need to grow
against
up
this.
and go along
And
with
a
it.
lot of artists understand that now, and some labels understand it better, and they're making adjustments. They're putting more content out there for free, or trying, to build their content into things like audio streams where there's a little bit of advertising and make their money that way. But just selling the CDs and going after a handful of people for illegally making copies or downloading, it hasn't worked to this point. It's becoming harder, not easier, for the recording industry and for the prosecutors to get a handle on this. It's time to realize that you need a new business model, regardless of whether you think that people should download music without paying for it or not. It is unenforceable, really, in real terms. It just is. I would bet just about everybody out there watching us below the age of 30, maybe certainly below the ages of 25, I would bet that just about all of you have illegally downloaded music. So it's something pretty much everybody does, and it's just beyond the recording industry's control at this point. So figure something else out, because what you're doing isn't working.
Yeah, well, speaking of figuring something else out, Nick, a lot of people have figured out that the dollar is backed by absolutely nothing because, well, it's becoming worth less and less. Suddenly, my dollars that used to buy me all this stuff, they buy me less of it. What's going on here? Must not be backed by gold or silver. And actually, people are starting to realize this, Nick. 5 years ago when we did this show, really, people didn't realize that money wasn't backed by anything.
They're talking about the story we're about to talk about on NPR, which I think is just amazing. I never would have believed it 4 or 5 years ago. Understanding of monetary policy among the general public, it might not still be great, but I think at least among that portion of the public, like you if you're watching this show, who are at least a little bit curious about ideas and about the way the world around them works, and that's not everybody out there. There are plenty of them out there not watching this show and not paying attention to the news and who are just ignorant. That's fine. I'm not going to preach that everybody has to know everything, but among that section of the population that wants to understand how things work, I think there's been a dramatic improvement in the understanding of monetary policy, the understanding of real monetary policy, not just the aerial view, the bird's eye view that you get of it, and the Keynesian view, which is basically, oh well, paper money works the best, and that's a system we have now, and there's nothing else you should really think about.
The major issue there, though, is since we got off a gold standard, or started getting off a gold standard, less than 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago, the dollar has lost 98% of its value. That's a lot of percentage points, 98%. And it's growing at a faster and faster rate, more rapid than ever before. And there's been a lot of states, and we've talked about this, that have proposed coining their own currency that is actually backed by something. In fact, other countries are thinking about it too. Russia was thinking about creating a currency that was backed by a gold standard, but no one's really done anything until this week.
Yeah, and this doesn't actually have to do with the minting of new currency. It just has to do, in real terms, more with how the state of Utah, in this case, and there are other states proposing similar things, but it's dealing with how the state of Utah handles gold and silver coin and its use as money. It's not going to be legal tender in the sense that business owners are not going to be forced to accept it. But Utah legislators want to see the dollar regain its former glory, back to the days when one could literally bank on it being good as gold. To make that point, they've turned it around and made gold as good as cash. Utah became the first state in the country this month to legalize gold and silver coins as currency. The law will also exempt the sale of coins from state capital gains tax. In states where there's sales tax, you have to pay that. Then there's the federal capital gains tax if you buy gold at one price, sell it at another. Utah's saying they're not going to enforce that. I guess the feds are still out there, but they're not going to be enforcing that provision. So the idea here, at least according to the sponsor, Brad Galvez, is not necessarily to try to force a return to the gold standard. I would like to see a return to something like the gold standard, personally. I know there are problems with that standard too. I'm not saying it's perfect, but in terms of helping you retain your purchasing power, maintaining the value of the currency, it's much, much better, and it does lend itself to quite a bit of stability. I know there are problems with it too, and we don't have time to get into them right here, but I think overall it's worth a look. He's saying, Brad Galvez is a Republican state rep who introduced this bill. He says Americans are losing faith in the dollar, and he says if you're mad about government debts, ditch the cash, spend your gold and silver. I would ditch the cash and buy gold and silver if it were me, because they'll retain their value. But he says his idea is not to return to the gold standard. He says, quote, we're too far down the road to go back to the gold standard. This would move us towards an alternative currency. And I think that's a great idea, because I think the future of the dollar
backed by something.
Right. Well, it's using gold and silver as they're, just basically.
And this is interesting. It is interesting that you do right now. It is illegal to call something a coin, apparently, and if it's not a federal dollar, right, you can't use a coin that you mint that's made out of silver and call it a coin. The Liberty Dollar found this out in a very tough way when all their facilities were raided and all their gold and silver was stolen by the federal government because the federal government didn't like them competing using gold and silver as a currency against the US dollar.
Right, and I think it's vitally important that right now we give people the ability to make choices like this, because I think that the future of the dollar, at least in the long run, I'm not saying the next 6 months or year or even couple of years necessarily. I think there's a chance that it could lose its value dramatically over that time. There's always a chance. But I think over the long run, I'm very skeptical that the US dollar will hold its value. And free people should be able to decide to swap pieces of metal for other pieces of metal, or
competition is always good.
All right, whatever they want to do.
We're out of time, Nick. Until next week, it's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
FreeMindsTV.com. In the meantime, have a great night. There we go.
I should be in Keene, New Hampshire with the Free Staters.